Right. Good evening and welcome to this rather wonderful gardening event. Thank you to firstly the audience for all joining us. You're all looking wonderful. Not that I can see any of you. We've got Chris, we've got Sally, we've got Kate. We're going to have an hour of chat. My name's Ben. I run our bookshop in Tring. Firstly, let me just give you the rules of engagement. I am literally going to be here feeding your questions. So I've already received a few from Hon Lee. Thank you, Liz Baker. Thank you, Jacqueline Palmer. Thank you, Colin Hendry Smith. So I'm going to feed those questions in. Anyone who hasn't sent questions by email, you've got the Q&A function. Use the Q&A function along the bottom and I will feed those in. If you've just got random cheeky comments to make, use the chat function. I'm sure I'll feed those in as well. But without further ado, because I know it's going to be a very full hour, just based on the questions I received, I'm going to waste no time. I'm going to hand you over to Chris Young, who is our host for the evening.
Thank you very much, Ben. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome along. Thank you for being here tonight and not at the pub, as we were having released from lockdown. So it's great to have such a good audience tonight. And my name's Chris Young. I have a couple of jobs. I work for DK, the publishers, as a consultant gardening publisher. And I also work part-time for the RHS. I've been formerly the editor of the Garden magazine for a few years. So I've got a bit of a dual hat tonight. But you're all most welcome. And thank you, Ben, for hosting us tonight. It's great. I'm delighted with tonight because this is the first time we've done it. First time we've brought DK and RHS authors together and to talk on pretty similar topics. And I'm delighted to introduce our two guests. First is Sally Nex, gardener, writer, regular contributor to the Garden magazine, the RHS magazine, and is passionate advocate about environmental gardening. And Kate Bradbury, a well-known wildlife expert. She gets excited about all things creatures, biodiversity, the natural world. You've been very excited about toads and frogs and frog spawn lately, haven't you, Kate? So it's great to have you both tonight. I think the context for this is that increasingly in the gardening world, we are finding that people are understanding more about the value of nature and more about the value of wildlife and the environment. And this is clearly something to be most welcomed. And it just so happens that these two books that have come out just in the last few weeks, the How to Garden the Low Carbon Way and How to Create a Wildlife Pond, have both come out, and they're sharing this topic, which is care, attention, understanding for wildlife and for the environment. So that's what we're talking about tonight, and the audience questions will be most welcome. But look, Sally, I wanted to start with you. You've been gardening for quite a few years now. What are the changes you've seen over those years in the way that gardeners view the environment?
Well, it's been a sort of steady build, really. I mean, when I started out, being organic was a really revolutionary thing to do, and a little bit crackpot, if you know what I mean. Like you had garden organic and things like that, but basically it was quite an unusual way to go about things. And since then, we've come around to, I think, probably just a much more sophisticated way of viewing gardening in an environmentally friendly way. So, for example, I think we now understand that just being organic, although that's a very good thing, is not necessarily enough. You can be organic and still harm the environment. I mean, peat is organic. So as an organic gardener, you're allowed to use peat. So I think that those kind of sophistications, and there's also, of course, in the time when I've been gardening, the whole issue of climate change has become a really big thing. That wasn't even a thing when I started gardening. And so there's been lots of thinking about how gardens kind of fit into the bigger picture, how they contribute to climate change, how they can help mitigate climate change, all sorts of different thoughts along those lines. And I think that the line between gardens and the wider environment, nature and the natural world has become very, very blurred, increasingly blurred as time goes on.
Great. And Kate, from your point of view, I mean, it's a similar question really, because wildlife gardening has got much more momentum and seems to have more understanding than, say, environmental gardening. What are the changes you've seen over the years?
Yeah, I mean, the changes have been huge, really. I mean, I've worked for Gardeners' World magazine for 15 years now, sort of first as a sort of staff member and the last 8 years as a freelancer, and you know, in that time, you know, as Sally says, you know, there's been a shift, and for me as a wildlife gardener, the shift was, you know, from me begging to write about bees to my editor saying we need to have something about bees this month. Yeah. And pest control as well. You know, when I first started writing for the magazine, they just started to add organic methods of pest control as well as the synthetic chemical methods to remove pests. And now, you know, the sort of synthetic chemical methods get barely a mention. The organic mention's there, but now we've got, you know, this further step, which is actually don't control the pests, you know, create habitats in your garden to let the wildlife come and control those pests for you. And particularly things like caterpillars, which have always been presented as the enemy to the gardener. You know, now I'm getting articles published in several publications where we're, you know, I'm advocating growing caterpillar food plants specifically for birds and for hedgehogs and the other things that eat them. So that's a huge positive step, and yeah, it's been something that's been growing in momentum, I think, over the last 15 years. Absolutely,
yeah, that really is a change. Sally, just coming back to you, I think we all know what it means, but the title of the book talks about gardening the low carbon way, and carbon is a word that's being used a lot nowadays. What did you really mean by that in the title? What's the essence of that for the book?
Well, I think it's just gardening while keeping that in mind, keeping the whole issue of your carbon emissions and also conversely how much carbon your garden is able to absorb. Because I think we all know that, for example, planting trees absorbs more carbon than planting annual bedding, for example. And it's just a matter of just tweaking your gardening really so that you are always acting to lock as much carbon as possible into your garden, and at the same time minimizing your own carbon emissions while you're actually going about your gardening business. So it's about, you know, things like not using petrol mowers, an obvious win, really, quite easy. That means that you've cut your carbon emissions straight away. And then on the plus side, if you don't turn your soil any more than you absolutely have to, if you just mulch instead and you lock that carbon into the soil, something like 83% of the carbon that's in your garden is in your soil. It's not in the plants at all. So if you can keep it in there for as long as you possibly can, then obviously your little garden is playing its part as the great sort of garden carbon sink. And I think that that's just a wonderful way to see it, is you can do your little bit, even though it's a tiny, tiny bit, but when you add it up between all the sort of millions of gardens that we've got, then it adds up to something quite substantial, and it can really, really help just to play our little part in helping to mitigate climate change.
I'll jump in there. I've got Honley asked a question. Is there a particular soil that's more carbon-free friendly?
An organic matter-rich soil is the one that's most carbon-friendly, the one that contains most carbon. Basically, it's not so much about the soil itself, as in the sort of, you know, the subsoil and the rocks and so on. It's about the carbon that gets drawn down into the soil through dying plants, through roots, through dying insects and animals, all those kinds of things that used to be living that end up in your soil, and that's how the carbon comes down into your soil and becomes locked there.
Sally, this is what I love talking about you, because you say, you know, things just off the top of your head, and then there's like 27 questions in my head that I want to ask you, and I've forgotten about 26 and a half of them. So I'm going to come back to Kate and just say, because it is kind of linked what Sally was talking about. But you know, a few years ago, if you had to have a wildlife garden, you had to have a bit of a tatty garden with lots of dandelions and lots of nettles, and it had to not look too polished or too gardening. That's really quite different now, isn't it? People's understanding of what wildlife wants and where wildlife is most happy is really quite different from where we might have been 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's a really good thing. That actually, you know, there's been a sort of meeting of minds really between ecologists and gardeners to actually create a compromise, I think. You know, I mean, the messy gardens with the dandelions and the nettles are absolutely brilliant for wildlife, but that's not to say that tidier gardens aren't. I think it is still really important to have messy areas, maybe behind your shed, or under a bench, or tucked around a corner that you can't see, where you let the grass grow a bit longer, or you let twigs and logs pile up and things like that. But you can also make a feature of these things as well. You can make a feature of long grass around an apple tree, for example. You can make a feature of a log pile, and that all helps to enhance the beauty of the wildlife garden and the tidiness of it, if you like. We're gardeners at the end of the day, and as gardeners we like to create things, we like to control things, and I think, yeah, initially there was a real fear that in having a wildlife garden you would lose that control, you would lose that control of your land, and that's not the case. You can dig up plants, you can mow your lawn, you can do whatever you like, but you can do things in a more wildlife friendly way.
Interestingly, the whole business about leaving your garden undisturbed, or corners of your garden undisturbed, that absolutely dovetails in with the idea of having a low carbon garden, because the less disturbance there is, and also the taller your grasses and the deeper and more fibrous their roots, the more carbon you're locking into your garden as well. So it all kind of plays into the same thing.
Well, it's fascinating, because I remember when we used to live in a different house, and we had a small garden, literally sort of 4 by 5 meters squared. I used to leave the grass long and tatty around the shed, and and I remember talking to my wife, and she was saying, well, can't you just tidy it up? And I said, but even that tiny little strip, a 30-centimeter strip, is better than having a manicured. The rest of the garden are quite neat and tidy, but actually just having all these little areas, as you say, Sally, about these little corners, it's actually really important, because it is about the way all of those little bits and corners actually join up to make a greater whole, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely right. And I think that, you can, just as Kate's saying, you can have a really lovely, tidy garden if you want to, but there are lots of different ways of managing it in such a way that you don't have to disturb it, that you can leave it, as unintrusively gardened as possible. But it doesn't have to be messy. It doesn't have to be a wilderness. It's a kind of rewilding without the wilding, if you know what I mean, or invisibly rewilding. It's a matter of helping your garden to be closer to nature without losing the fact that it's a garden. I keep saying, I love to have my garden really wild, and anybody who knows my garden will tell you it's really wild. But I also think I don't want to live in a nature reserve. That's not what I'm about. I'm a gardener. I love my garden to look pretty. I love flowers. I love all of these things. There's no reason you shouldn't have all of that, and for it still to be undisturbed and high carbon and high biodiversity too.
I'm going to jump in for a question. Caroline Hendry Smith, what are the advantages of a man-made liner over using clay to line a pond? Would clay be better for the environment, but more difficult or expensive to line a pond with? Any recommendations as to what to do with the soil you dig out, apart from hiring a skip? I'd have to say I'm on the verge of doing exactly the same thing. So what is the best answer there?
I think puddling clay is really good. It creates a really natural finish for the pond. It's often used in quite large ponds. I've never done one myself, but my friend keeps trying to rope me in to do one at her garden. And yeah, I think they look really good. There's potential for cracking and all things like that. I think a clay pond is quite high maintenance in terms of, you have to spend a lot of time preparing it. Whereas with a liner, a butyl liner, for a garden pond, really, I mean, my garden's like 40 foot long, it's quite small, and my pond took a day. And I've never spent longer than a day doing a pond. So, you dig the hole, you lay down the fabric that goes under the butyl liner, you lay the butyl liner, you can do other things on top of it to sort of make it look more natural, or you can leave it as it is, and it doesn't take that long. So that's what I'd say about clay versus liner. And then as regards the soil at the bottom, what I do these days with my ponds is I use the subsoil from the bottom of the hole to actually cover the pond liner. So the insulating fleece that you buy with the butyl liner, that you lay beneath the butyl liner, if you buy a second layer of fleece and lay that over the liner, then you can pack this subsoil onto it. And subsoil is lower in nutrients, so you don't get algal blooms or anything like that in the water, so it's low nitrogen. and then you plant directly into it, and so it looks more like a clay pond, but is actually a mixture of liner and fleece and mud. Otherwise, just chuck it around the garden. I mean, it doesn't actually take long before it's just sort of recycled in your borders.
Or bund, or you make a bit of a bund at one back of it, so that actually you get that height difference.
Yeah.
So
or
you
make
can
a bank.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So look, Kate, I haven't shown everyone your lovely book, how to create a wildlife pond. Sorry, I should know the title by now. Well done, you have one too. So I know, really silly question, but I've got to ask it. What is it about ponds that you love so much, and why would you want to write a book about them?
Well, I think, if I'm really honest, it's probably because I wasn't allowed one when I was a kid. I fell into a pond in a well-known garden centre when I was 6, and my mum was busy looking at plants, and so sort of ever since that day, yeah, the whole question of having a pond in the garden was rejected quite strongly, but the next door neighbours had a pond, and I was just really obsessed with it as a kid, and I was really obsessed with frogs, and you know, I still am, and I just think they're magical. And when I finally got to dig a pond in my mum's garden, I was 24. When I finally had my own garden in which I could dig my very own pond, I was in my mid-30s, and it just feels like reliving, you know, just having a bit of that childhood that I was denied so fiercely when I was a child, and it's brilliant. I mean, I've always loved gardening, I've always loved wildlife gardening, and pond is really the best thing you can do for the wildlife in your garden, and I think for you, I just sit by the pond and I just gawp at tadpoles all day, and it's wonderful.
I couldn't agree more. I feel I've come of age of the grand age of 45, and I've just made myself a swimming pond and things. But I've never realised, you know, people talk about you have a bowl of water, or you put a little bit of water outside, and suddenly you will get wildlife there, and somehow it smells it, finds it, whatever. And it is exactly true. But I think it does feel kind of like a rite of passage, especially if you're relatively keen on being outside or the environment or being a gardener, to have water just seems to be the most special element of a garden, because it does reflect light differently. It does bring in different wildlife, even if you've got fish. Because what I wanted to ask you, Kate, is can you just explain the difference in types of ponds? Because you've explained about your pond being a very wildlife garden because you put soil back in there. For me, I'm using it actually more for wildlife, but also to swim in. It's not that big, but I'm throwing myself in to try and get cool some days. So I've got no fish in it, but because it's been talked about that if you have too many fish, then they're quite predatory, and actually they reduce the amount of wildlife. So can you just explain the different type of ponds people might want to put in their garden?
Okay. So, you know, a wildlife pond like mine looks very natural. It's got natural edges, sort of grass and bird's foot trefoil around the edge, and yeah, no fish. And the thing about fish is that, as beautiful as they are, they do eat everything. They will eat all the tadpoles. They will eat all the invertebrate larvae. So the actual wildlife that's coming in to breed in the pond, it's just a sort of dead end for them, really. Apart from toads. Toads will seek out a fish pond because toads and their tadpoles are slightly poisonous. And so toads will lay eggs in a fish pond because they know that the fish will eat all the competition before they eat the toads. So wow. Very, very clever. So, you know, if you've got a fish pond and you're saying, hang on a minute, but I've got tadpoles and they're fine, they're probably toads. I mean, you know, there's 4 pond designs in my book. There's the sort of really wildlife one, which is with the natural edges. There's a couple of container ponds in there because not everyone wants to dig a pond, and you know, a lot of people have very young children, which obviously, you know, you might think twice about digging a big pool of water in your garden for a couple of years. And then there's a sort of slightly more formal design as well, where you can sort of lay it with paving stones, edge it with paving stones rather, which has certain limitations for some wildlife, but can still be a really great pond, but just sort of maintain that slightly formal look.
Sally, I just want to come to you because it's interesting what Kate was just explaining to the question there about how to make it and what, you know, whether you puddle clay or use plastic. I think I just want to bring in your point about this kind of balance. So we don't want people to feel guilty about doing certain things. Just like we were saying about leaving a bit of grass here or there is great. It was all these little actions, because Kate was talking about maybe that sort of liner and then putting the membrane underneath it. I've used butol liner in my pond, but I had my bottom in the air for days because I was in people's skips getting old carpets. And my wife is furious because we had this carpet mound, but I used that instead of buying some sand, and I put that underneath the liner. So it's important, isn't it, that we take people with us and that we don't make people feel guilty if they have a bit of plastic over here, but they're doing something really positive over there. How did you get that balance right in the book?
Yeah, very much so. Well, I took the view that it's a gradual thing, that you can do as much or as little for the environment as you are capable or want to or can do, but it's important that you do something, however little that might be. So, I mean, for example, with ponds, it's wonderful if you have the resources and the expertise to do a puddle clay pond, because those are by far the most environmentally friendly in terms of the fact that they're plastic free and using natural materials and so on and so forth. So by far the best sort of version of an environmentally friendly pond is definitely puddle clay. However, it's certainly beyond my expertise, and I'm not quite sure. As I understand it, they're much better on clay soils. Now, I garden on gritty chalk, and I can pretty much guarantee you that if I tried to build a puddle clay pond in my garden, it would move or crack or something would happen, and I'm fairly sure it wouldn't work. In that case, you just have to kind of weigh it up and think to yourself, I'd rather not use plastic, obviously, but the fact is that if I don't use plastic, I don't have a pond, is what you're weighing up.
Yeah.
Having said that, I have actually created quite a lovely pond out of an old butler sink in my vegetable garden at the moment, which is plastic free. So you can get around it other ways. But basically, if you need to use plastic, because the benefits that you get from having a pond in your garden in terms of the biodiversity and so on are so great that you're bringing in another good, if you know what I mean. So it's never clear cut. The more I kind of think about gardening in an environmentally friendly way, the more I realize there is no black and white. There is still things to be weighed up all the time. You do one thing that's environmentally friendly, but you cause harm in another way. And it's a matter of working out what's within your capabilities, what's the best you can do given what you've got. And just doing the best you can. I mean, I think that as long as we're all aware of it, as long as we know the implications of everything that we do, then the way that we behave, mindful of that, is always going to be better than not caring or not taking any notice of it.
I will jump in. So a couple of questions relating to ponds. I completed. This is Lynn. I completed constructing a wildlife pond at the very end of last year, and filled it with rainwater. Currently, the water is slightly green with algae. I went to a local pond and filled a jam jar with pond water containing lots of water fleas, which I know as Daphnia. I emptied the jam jar into my pond. Is this a good way to remove the algae? Similar question from Sandra, albeit a lot shorter. What is the best plant for keeping water clean in your pond?
I'd say that the jam jar with the Daphnia in it was probably the source of the algae, possibly.
Sounds like it was green before then.
Okay, but yeah, it's. I think traditional advice was to go and get a bit of water from another pond and sort of help populate your pond with that. But the advice has sort of changed actually in the last few years because of potential for invasive pond plants to spread and amphibian diseases as well. But don't worry. I mean, there's nothing bad's going to happen. The algae grows in nitrogen-rich water, so it's really good that you filled it with rainwater, because rainwater is typically low in nitrogen. Tap water is typically higher in nitrogen. So a lot of times, if you have to fill up your pond with tap water, which occasionally people do, then you're more likely to get sort of algal blooms, as they're called, which is the pond water going green. And the best thing to do to reduce the likelihood of this happening is to grow lots of plants. So for a wildlife pond, you want about 2/3 of the surface covered with plants, and all of those plants feed on the nitrogen in the water, which basically denies the algae the nitrogen, so that doesn't grow as quickly. You always need a little bit of algae because that's what tadpoles eat. And then things like barley straw. I use barley straw in my pond. You can buy it from pet shops, and just sort of I just use garden twine to sort of roll it up and just chuck a bit in the bottom of the pond, and as that breaks down, that sort of inhibits algal growth as well. And then fishing it out. If you've got blanket weed, fish it out. The algae that sort of goes green, it does eventually turn into sort of blanket weed and stuff like that. So if you just get a bamboo cane and sort of wind it around like candy floss, so you can get it out.
Okay, thank you. On that, some people might be a bit concerned about buying aquatic plants because there are some horror stories, aren't there, of introducing invasive plants through water, and they're getting out into the natural water stream. What's your advice for people when they're buying, and how do they go about buying aquatic plants?
I think the thing with aquatic plants is it's really important to just really research what you're buying. Don't just turn up to a garden centre and just buy what looks nice. As lovely as that is, sometimes invasive plants are mislabeled. And there was someone brought my attention to something that happened the other day on Twitter, actually, about a plant being mislabeled as one thing, labelled as one thing, and it was actually another thing. But I mean, what I do is I just grow native pond plants because they've evolved with the wildlife knows where they are with it, and there's no danger of any, if anything does get out into the wild, you know, it's just not going to block up waterways, starve rivers of oxygen, all of those things that some invasive pond plants do. And I just think it's safer that way.
So the practical advice is what is to Google native UK British native plants and to see who's selling them.
I mean, there is a book actually you can buy which has got a list of native pond plants in it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, things like water forget-me-not, which is a really lovely marginal plant. Brook lime is another really lovely marginal plant. Newts use the leaves of those plants to lay their eggs. They lay individual eggs in a folded up leaf, which is super cute. You know, things like marsh marigolds, which dragonflies sort of climb up in spring to sort of shed their skins, and things like hornwort, which is an oxygenator. And they're all, you know, I mean, brook lime grows a fair pace, but you know, the others, they're not that vigorous, and because they're not that vigorous, you don't have to sort of control them as much, and because you don't have to control them as much, they're less likely to end up on the compost heap, or they're being picked up by a bird and used in a nest and then dropped, you know, in a river or something like that. So I would always go with native in the pond.
Okay, this is a real sort of RHS and maybe kind of DK question here, but you know, on instructions when you get aquatic plants, that they say, well, they're marginal, or they could be grown at a depth of 20 centimeters or a range of 40 to 60 centimeters depth on a different ledge or a different shelf. How kind of horticultural do you have to be with aquatic plants, or are they pretty tough? It's
quite complicated, isn't it? I would say, yeah, you can take it with a pinch of salt, really. It's good. I think with water lilies, they really need to be at the correct depth, don't they? But with marginals, you know, I find that you can sort of plant them quite deep, and then I've had brooklines sort of self-seeding into my border and doesn't get any water at all, and it's fine. Well, it's not fine because I keep ripping it out, but it would be fine. So yeah, I think, you know, there are the ones that you drop in. There's the, you know, the oxygenators that you just drop into the water. They find their own levels, which is just perfect. And with the marginals, I think, yeah, as long as their feet are wet, sometimes that's largely okay.
Okay, so you're pretty relaxed about it.
I'm quite relaxed about it.
Okay, Sadie, I'm just going to come to you guys. A complete different thing. You mentioned plastic, and I think you know, plastic is a big topic, and it has been for a few years now. And I know that when you were writing for the Garden magazine, we commissioned you to do a series of we started talking, didn't we, about not gardening with any plastic, and then actually the series became how do I garden with reduced plastic, because you kind of found out really that it's pretty impossible to be completely plastic free, isn't it, in the garden? Where do you think people are on that journey of plasticity in their garden use?
Oh, well, sadly, I think right at the beginning still.
That's a good timing for us.
The trouble is, plastic is still the default option for absolutely everything. You go into a garden centre and you look around you, and say if you're going shopping for, I don't know, a watering can, you will find 9 watering cans which are plastic and maybe 1 galvanised one on the end, 2 if you're lucky perhaps. If you are buying plants they all come in plastic pots. It's the exception which are in biodegradable pots or hairy pots. It's never the rule. And I mean, I've been trying to find a cloche lately, okay, because it's very frosty at night. It'd be quite nice to be able to put cloche over my seedlings, right, to protect them. I'd really like to buy a barn cloche, okay? They exist. They're glass cloches, basically, which are held together with slightly complicated wire clips. But the Victorians use them all the time. You've probably seen them around, you know, in pictures of Victorian gardens and stuff like that. They're very traditional. I have never found one in a garden centre. The only cloches you can find in garden centres are plastic. There is simply not an option to be plastic free. It's possible to be plastic free. You can buy a barn cloche, but you're not given that option when you walk into any of the kind of mainstream places where you buy gardening gear. And so in order to find your barn cloche, you have to do like me, and you have to do lots of online research. Then you have to find the bits of glass from your local glazier, and you have to, it takes a lot of bloody minded persistence to be plastic free. And to be quite honest, not everyone's obsessed as I am about it.
That is probably fair to say, yeah.
And it has to be easier to be plastic free than it is at the moment. At the moment, it's really hard, and you have to try very, very hard and be very determined. Whereas I'd like to see a day where plastic free is the mainstream, and you buy plastic only when you really, really have to, only for those applications where there really isn't anything else. At the moment, it's the other way around.
But give us some hope, because we've got, you know, all these people have come along to listen to you, and but people can do it, can't they?
Yes.
And is the message really about reducing where you can? So if you can't find your cloche, you still need to buy your cloche because you want to grow your seedlings, and actually you want to grow your plants. So is it just actually, if you're saying we're the beginning of this journey, is it just by every little small action will help, so that actually that you keep reusing plastic pots, or that if you're going to get a load of compost, you get it delivered in a bulk buy rather than lots of individual 40-litre bags? Is that the approach?
Yes, to be quite honest, there's an awful lot that you can do at home with just materials that you have around you. So for example, I now don't use plastic. I grow a lot of vegetables, so I raise a lot of seeds at this time of year. And I don't use any plastic from sowing all the way through till planting out in the garden now. Partly because I found that my seedlings do better without plastic anyway. What I do is I'll sow them into wooden seed trays. I'll prick them out into newspaper pots. From there they go onto, I've my own patented model of cardboard homemade pots out of waste cardboard that comes through. We've all been ordering a lot from certain online retailers lately. Well, I turn all that cardboard into plant pots. And you know what? It is wonderful, because I have found that when you can grow something where the roots don't have to circle, they're not trapped in plastic, they don't have to circle round and round in tighter, you know, little kind of bundles. They actually burst through the cardboard, and they look like nothing on earth, because the cardboard breaks up a bit and the roots come out and it all looks very hairy, and you have to almost scoop this kind of bundle of plant and root and half decomposed cardboard out of the tray, and it makes lots of people quite scared. But really, it's the best way to grow plants. That's how plants grow in nature. So I found that as soon as you start growing plants like that, you kind of put your bundle of half decomposed cardboard and roots and plant into the ground, and I found that they establish much quicker than those grown in plastic, simply because they don't have the recovery time. The roots don't have to figure out not to go round and round in circles, but to go outwards. That takes time if you're transplanting a plant outside. If you do one that's been grown in cardboard or newspaper, they just grow straight out right from the get-go, and it's a much nicer way of gardening in all possible respects, not just from the plastic reduction, but just because it makes your plants grow better.
I've got a connected question, I suppose. Jacqueline Palmer, I have a wooden compost bin, but it seems to take a year for everything to break down, despite turning and watering it, etc. I wanted to ask Sally whether they would recommend the hot bins. Now, the hot bins, are they the plastic ones? I don't know if they are. They seem quite expensive. Is there anything I could do to speed up the composting process?
Well, she's doing quite a lot already by turning it regularly, and that will speed it up as much as anything. I think, I mean, as from what I hear, hot bins are fantastic and they do compost really, really quickly.
Sally, Sally, can we just explain the two different types, like a Dalek compared to a hot bin, because they're different things, aren't they?
Yeah, sure. Well, an open wooden compost bin is just an ordinary compost bin which is open to the elements, which you pile all your green waste into, breaks it down. Usually what most people do is cold composting, which I think is what this person's talking about, where you do have to wait 6 months to a year for your compost to decompose properly. It would probably help, incidentally, if she put in a few more greens, perhaps. That sounds to me as if it might be just a little bit too brown. So, you know, those kind of fast rotting things do tend to speed things up as well, especially if you're turning it regularly. Now, hot bins, on the other hand, are very heavily insulated boxes. You put your compost in the middle and they don't let any of the heat escape. So the heat really can build up on inside, and that means that they rot down extremely quickly. To be quite honest, I've ruled out ever getting a hot bin, much though I'd kind of like to. But the thing is that for me, it's made out of polystyrene. I can't possibly justify that for my gardening just because I try to be environmentally friendly, and that to me is not an environmentally friendly thing to do, to buy a great big chunk of polystyrene so that you can compost quicker. I think with me, you know, I have 3 compost bins on the go all the time. I don't mind having to wait a year because I'm turning them, and generally speaking, they come up ready every kind of 3 months, if you see what I mean, 3 to 4 months. And that's enough to mulch most of my borders, to do a little bit of homemade compost making, that kind of thing. So I think that as long as you're turning it quickly, as long as you are putting lots and lots of fast rotting stuff in there, so manure, green weeds, you know, all of those kinds of things, grass clippings, all of those kinds of things, then it should speed it up a little bit more than perhaps it is at the moment.
Kate, were you going to say something?
I've got a hot bin.
I have as well. Brilliant.
Yeah, I was just going to add that it's good, but I don't think it's that good. I mean, it's, you know, it breaks down quicker, but compared to my other compost bins, yeah, it's I mean, maybe I'm not doing it well. You're looking at me like maybe I'm doing it really badly. But,
no, all I was thinking with the hot bin is but again, isn't this interesting? This is a balance. There's 3 people here, different types of gardeners, probably similar in all of our desire to reduce our impact on Earth. But my hot bin, I put all of our food waste in, because on the rear, because they're heavily insulated, they're rat proof, they've got a good lid, and so that's my way of not putting any waste in my landfill, because we don't have food collection here curbside. So I'm kind of making that balance there, that actually I'm bringing plastic in, but I'm getting nice compost out of it, but I'm putting all of the food waste in there. So it's interesting. So but Sally doesn't want to bring the plastic in. You have, Kate, but you're not maybe finding it works as well.
You have to mix a hot bin.
There's a what, sorry?
You have to mix a hot bin, and you know.
Well, you have to add bark, and I mean, I don't add bark. I add cardboard instead. But I do find it gets quite wet. It heats up. It's incredible, the heat that comes off it. And you know, it is plastic, and I make sure I look after it very much, so that you know it doesn't degrade. But I would say, you know, the food angle is really good. You know, no food goes into landfill from my house. It all goes into the hot bin. It's brilliant for that. But in terms of actually speeding up the compost, yeah, you can get compost out within 3 months, but it's I sort of have to sieve it really to sort of get it's not really usable at 3 months. I actually prefer the compost that comes out of my open compost bin. Open compost bin, open compost heap. Which I just
Ben, I think if we ever do a book on compost, we could have hours on compost.
There is actually, I tell you what, before we leave the subject, there is actually another solution for your food waste. Just make yourself a wormery. You could actually make your own wormery. You don't even have to buy one. There's instructions in my book.
There is, yeah. There is
and it's easily made from materials that you probably have around you already, and that will take food waste as well.
Yeah, very good idea. I make some lovely stuff at the end of it. Right, I'm going to change tack. Kate, I'm going to come to you. I think one of the things I loved about the book is not only the fact that it's instructional and you know, that it's got the detail on how to do it, but it reminds us and it broadens us out into the seasons. And this is what I love about it. It reminds you of the importance, in this case, of ponds, but being at the center of this circle of life and this kind of biodiversity and this balance that we're inhabiting when we're in a garden space, and that kind of essence of seasonality, the different things that come through your garden and through your pond through the year. Was that quite important to you to get that message across?
Yeah, it really was. I didn't just want it to be like an instructional how to build a pond book, because I wanted it to have life, and I wanted people to read about the pond as its own life force in the garden, really. And taking it through the seasons, they're just completely different. In summer it's just so alive. The water is just full of invertebrate larvae and tadpoles and little things hopping out, and like frogs sheltering on hot days. And then in the evening you get bats coming in, you get dragonflies coming out, you get hedgehogs drinking at the surface, you can even get hedgehogs swimming in the pond. It's just endless excitement and wonder. And then in winter it just all goes really quiet. But there's beauty in that quietness, just the way the water just sort of sits and is so still and just reflects the winter lights. There's just so many beautiful, wonderful things about it, and I just wanted to take the reader sort of through that excitement, really, of just knowing what a pond will bring to your garden.
And tell me, when we talk about a pond, we probably should have asked this at the beginning. Is there an ideal size? Because can we talk about Sally's butler sink, which is filled with water, to somebody with a great big lake? Is there an optimum size, or just it doesn't matter?
Well, everyone says the larger the pond, the more wildlife you're going to get. But most of us have quite average size gardens. I mean, as I said, my garden's 40 foot long. I live in a Victorian terrace. My pond takes up 2/3 of my lawn, but that's because I wanted a really big pond for the garden. It's probably 2 meters, 2.5 meters in length, and 1.5 meters at its widest. I would say if you're considering digging a pond, go a bit bigger than you think you want to, because you won't regret it, because it will just be wonderful. In terms of going the other end, and Sally's butler sink, I would say a butler sink's probably the smallest you want to go to. People do say, oh, washing up bowls is fine, but the thing about washing up bowl ponds is that you'll get some interesting life forms in there. You'll get little tardigrades and other little microscopic larvae, so microscopic life forms rather, that you can sort of look at under a microscope if you've got one, or things like that. But actually, if things like mosquitoes, for example, will lay eggs in a washing up bowl, but the things that eat the mosquito larvae won't. So you potentially you could be creating quite lovely conditions for mosquitoes, and unfortunately not their predators. I mean, mosquitoes lay eggs in my pond every summer, and I've never been bitten by one at home, because the back swimmers eat them, the bats eat them, the dragonfly larvae eat them. They just get eaten. And so I think having a pond big enough to have that ecosystem balance is really quite useful, really.
So something about 1 by 2 meters would be an ideal size, you're finding?
Yeah, I mean, I think 1.5 meters circle would be okay as well. I mean, that's about the size of my allotment pond, and that's got loads of stuff living in it. And if you can only go small, then go shallow, because all the life lives in the shallow. All the invertebrate larvae, all the tadpoles, they're all in the shallows, and that's because the water's warmer in the shallows. But it does mean that potentially, if you've got quite a small pond and you only go shallow, then you may have to sort of top it up in summer. So there's balancing acts.
What I've done with my butler sink is I've stacked, I put a load of bricks on one side. It's actually quite a large butler sink, but on one side I've got a fair old stack of bricks, and then I propped up, because I was very aware that things couldn't get out potentially. Yeah. So I made a ramp, and I did that by stacking up loads of bricks, and then I put a roof tile like sticking up out of the bricks onto the top of the butler sink, so that things could crawl up through it. But what I didn't realise was all the tadpoles love going underneath the tile, and they just all go and hide under there. And then you kind of, if you're being a bit kind of just want to have a look at your tadpoles, you lift up the tile, and they all just go like that all over the place. It's lovely. So there are sort of deep bits and also shallow bits on top of the bricks and all over the place. So it's working really well, actually. It's lovely.
We've hit a rich vein of a few questions that are kind of corresponding with what we're talking about. Let's have a few quick ones. Michael Perry, Mr. Plant Geek himself, where's best pond plant source? Where's the best place to get pond plants from?
There's a really great website called Naturescape. I think it's got a big, it's a nursery based in sort of Northampton way, I think, and they do loads of really good stuff. I quite like Puddle Plants as well. I've bought plants from there before, and they've always been really good. You can actually just get a frog. They just take the decision-making process away from you and just make it really easy. So you can just buy a frog collection of plants, which I think is quite cute. And they give you, and you just get a nice selection of marginals and oxygenators from them.
Right.
I find some good ones in garden centres, but I tend to find sometimes in garden centres that you get a bit of algae coming with the plants as well.
Right. And Julie Laughlin, do you need special plant pots for aquatic plants? I assume she's meaning those, obviously the ones with lots of holes in. But
yeah, it's good to use the ones with lots of holes in, because the pot then doesn't sort of float on the water, so it sort of sinks down evenly, and then if you top it up with stones, then the soil doesn't come out. But if you want to be plastic free, then you can buy pond plants, or you can buy separate sort of root balls, or and then pot them up into little coir sacks, or little jute sacks, which are also really good, and just sort of tie it up and pop those in your ponds, and it works in the same way.
Yeah, I had a bit of hessian left over. I was making hessian grow bags, and had some left over, and I was sorry to keep going back to the butler sink, but I was putting some plants in the butler sink. And if you have a square of hessian and you put some stones in the middle, and then wrap your hessian up around your pond plant and just tie it in with some just ordinary twine, that actually weights the plant down, and you don't have to. That was actually a division from a marsh marigold that I already had in my other pond, and that was just easy peasy to do. It really was, and it's flourished. So you don't even have to use a plastic pot if you don't want.
Ben, any more questions, or can I go back to?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. There's one from Liz Baker. I've had a small frog pond for 3 years, and whilst I sometimes see frogs in it, there are never any tadpoles. It's in a shady position, and I just leave it alone. The water is clear, or I do have some algae and a mossy pondweed, which I clear out occasionally. I garden organically and try and attract birds and insects into my garden. Is there anything I can do to encourage the frogs and toads to spawn?
So it was shady?
Yeah, it's a shady position, and I leave it alone.
Okay. Frogs, I mean, frogs tend or seem to prefer spawning in sunny spots, because the water warms up sooner in spring. So it could be that it's just not getting enough sun at the right time of year. Certainly in my pond, the frogs all spawned. It was their first spawning this year, and they all spawned in the bit of the pond that gets sun first thing in the morning, because they spawned in February, and we've had a few frosts since then. And every time the pond iced over, this little spot where the frogs had spawned was the first bit to melt, because it was the bit that got sun. So it could be that. I would check your shallows as well, but it's not necessarily that. I mean, it could be that, it could be that they prefer another pond sort of 2 doors down. I would think, don't despair. Check to see how shallow the shallow bits are, and if there's a nice sort of sloping beach area, because they do love a sloping beach area. Sometimes ponds can be a bit too deep for frogs, but then they're perfect for toads. So don't lose hope. And newts as well will use them. But again, if you've got newts, and you didn't mention newts, then that might put the frogs off, because newts eat a lot of tadpoles and frog spawn.
Yeah, Miranda jumped in with a question. Can you share frog spawn or tadpoles with others? My mother wants some for her new pond.
sadly, the advice isn't to no longer do that, which is a bit sad because it's such fun sharing frog spawn. But just because of amphibian diseases these days and invasive pond plants and things like that, it's best to wait to see what turns up in your pond naturally.
Okay. I want to just change the subject completely and ask about lawns, because you mentioned lawns, Kate, and I'm going to come to Sally on lawns. There's a British obsession about lawns, nice stripes and weed free and all of that. In the book, have you looked at lawns at all, or observations of why we like our stripy lawns, and are we changing in our habits of what we allow our lawns to look like?
Yeah, we are very fond of our lawns, aren't we? I blame Capability Brown because I think that, like, as for so many other things,
That's for so many things. Yeah.
The fact is that it was from about that time, or perhaps even a little bit earlier, that gardening was seen as controlling, was seen as you know, a way of inflicting control on nature. Nature was actually at that time, I suppose, a bit scary as well. So, you know, everybody needed a nice, safe space to be where, you know, scary nature was not. And I think that's kind of how that sort of garden came up. Nature is no longer scary. It's really lovely, actually. So we don't feel the same need, I don't think, to control it quite as much as perhaps we did. But then on the other hand, I mean, lawns, I like a lawn because I like to lie out on it and put the deck chair up, and, you know, it's a nice way of setting off your plants is another reason to have a lawn. There's lots of good reasons to have a lawn, but the stripes thing, I'm not so keen on. Apart from anything else, I really hate mowing the lawn. It's really boring. So I tend not to do too much of that. And so this whole kind of trend towards rewilding your lawn, oh, I love it. I just love it because it means I don't have to spend my Saturday afternoons going up and down in front of the blooming lawnmower. There are lots and lots of compromises to be had here. I have lawns of all sorts of different lengths in my garden. So I'll have a little square outside of my deck. I have a slightly complicated and rather muddled garden, but I have a little area where I can, you know, it's flat. We can sit on it if we want to, and you know, have picnics or whatever. The dogs can, you know, sniff around in it, all of that. I mow that maybe every couple of weeks, I guess, something like that. But then there are areas behind that that are still close to the house, so you still want them to look reasonably neat, which I maybe mow maybe once a month, something like that. Yeah. Then what happens is you get lots and lots of flowers. You get lots of dandelions and buttercups and clover, wonderful for the bees, wonderful for biodiversity, lots of nectar. Not very much biodiversity in terms of the plants themselves. They tend to be very common sort of lawn plants. They look lovely. It looks really, really pretty. Then there's a bit at the back of the garden, which I just let to go completely wild. And I let it grow right the way up, as high as it will get, you know, and just let it go. And I'll cut that down at the end of the year. So towards kind of end of August, early September time. Then what you get is you get the real wildflowers coming in. You get much more biodiversity of actual plants, and that's where the campion is and the oxeye daisies. I got an orchid in my top strip the other year, and I wouldn't even have known that that existed if I hadn't rewilded my lawn. So the more that I do it, it kind of gets better and better each year, because as wildflowers realise that they're able to germinate because they're allowed to, you tend to get more and more and more coming in. And I also, to be quite honest, I transplant wildflowers from other bits of the garden where they might not be quite so welcome because they self-seed. I transplant those into my rewilded lawn, and then they get going, and it's lovely. It's getting better every year.
Okay, so we need to relax on our lawns a bit, and also, you know, if they've got a higher mix of weeds, for want of a better word, or different plants in them, wildflowers, and they're not going to go so brown in drought in the summer, so you don't have to water them.
That's the other thing, and of course you can have lawns which don't have any grass in them at all, and those are wonderful because you don't have to mow them in the same way at all. And they do stay much greener in a drought. I mean, you can have a clover lawn if you want.
Okay, we've got 5 more minutes, sadly. We could be going on for a while. Kate, I'm going to come to you quickly. If there's one little bit kind of take-home advice for people about a wildlife pond or water in your garden, apart from do it, do you have anything else to enthuse us as why we should be getting water in our garden?
I think watering your garden is the best thing you can do for wildlife and yourself. If you don't have space to dig a pond, then a butler sink, as Sally has and I have in my front garden as well, is absolutely brilliant. Remember that you're making this thing for yourself as well as for wildlife. Make it as pretty as you want to, but just make sure it's got shallow beach areas so that hedgehogs can climb in and out safely, so that tadpoles can school like little fish, and so that you can see birds bathing as well. If you have the beach area, then you have a nice clear view of seeing birds bathe. And number one rule, I think, for planting ponds or digging ponds, creating a container pond, is to put a chair or a bench next to it, because you will want to sit and watch it all day long.
I love that advice, and I never knew hedgehogs could swim. Just shows how ignorant I am. Sally, the book that you've written, DK have produced it in a low carbon way. It's got, we've reduced the amount of ink that was used. It was printed locally, so it was reduced in terms of its sustainability in miles. What small actions can we take, or give us one small action we can take as if we want to be more environmental gardeners?
Oh, well, it's peat-free April. So one of the simplest things that you can possibly do is, when you buy a bag of compost, choose the peat-free option. It's pretty straightforward. It costs maybe £1 more. Sometimes the price is coming down all the time, actually. It's the single best thing that you can do in terms of reducing your carbon footprint of your garden. We all use loads of compost, and it's really, really easy to do. And these days, with good quality peat-free composts, you don't even have to change the way you garden.
Brilliant. I'm brilliant for getting the word peat in. We'd forgotten about that one, haven't we? We talked about so much else. Ben, are there any more questions from anyone else we need to cover off?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether Jacqueline Palmer, a question for Kate. I regularly put sunflower hearts and other seeds into bird feeders, but I seem to see the squirrels and wood pigeons enjoying them more than any other wildlife. Am I doing the right thing feeding Tring pigeons and squirrels, or would I be better off trying to grow more plants and seed heads, berries, which the birds could feed on? I have a battle, it's Ben against squirrel in our garden, and I'm forever trying to put the feeder higher up the wall, and honestly, they're always...
I think Jacqueline's right. Both options are good. I think maybe both you and she could invest in a squirrel-proof bird feeder. They are available. Some are better than others. I've got some, and am I allowed to say where I got them from? I got some from the RSPB, and they're just standard seed hoppers with a cage around it and a tray, and the tray stops the food spilling onto the ground, so that you don't get the pigeons sort of hoovering up stuff from the bottom, and it stops the squirrels from coming in. Buy high quality bird seed as well, because the low quality bird seed tends to be mixed up, have grains and things mixed up in it that some birds discard, which encourages pigeons again. But yes, do grow plants that seed, and don't deadhead them until sort of late winter, because they will provide natural sources of food for the birds. So all of that.
Beautiful. Anything else, Ben, from the audience?
There's a couple of questions. Jack sells for Sally. What are the best options if you don't have space for a greenhouse when trying to grow veg?
You can grow veg without a greenhouse, no problem at all. You actually, one entire chapter of the book actually is talking about asking yourself very carefully whether or not you really need a greenhouse. I have to say, I do have a greenhouse and I love it. Mine's a second-hand greenhouse. It's not a new one. There's quite a high carbon footprint involved with a new greenhouse, but you can get them second-hand ever so easily. Lots of people taking them down. However, if you don't have a greenhouse, there's lots and lots and lots of different ways that you can grow veg, even with a bit of protection in your veg garden, actually. Cloches, as I was talking about earlier, if you can go to the trouble of finding barn cloches, then that's fantastic. But cloches are wonderful. Also, cold frames are invaluable. They take up much less room. You can actually move them around the garden. One of the best ways of using a cold frame is actually kind of like a cloche, really. You put it over your seedlings, and once they've grown up enough and you've kind of hardened them off by using the lights on the cold frame, you can move the cold frame elsewhere in the garden. So you can sort of use it like an ersatz cloche, and that does as good as a greenhouse. And things like, say, tomatoes that you would normally grow in a greenhouse, you grow them in the greenhouse because you're trying to avoid blight usually as much as anything else. But nowadays, there are some fantastic blight-resistant tomatoes that you can grow very happily outside. I grow in the southwest, where it's warm and damp, which is exactly the conditions that late blight likes best. And we practically breathe blight spores around here. However, I've managed to grow both Mountain Magic, which is a kind of cordon small salad type tomato, and also Lizetto is another variety, which is a bush tomato, which you can grow in pots and hanging baskets even, covered in cherry tomatoes. Both of them really blight resistant. They grow very well outside here. There's no reason why you should have a greenhouse, in fact.
Brilliant.
Wonderful.
Well, look, I think it's 1 minute past 8. I think we should wrap up, Ben, should we?
Yeah, if you want to give a quick closing thing, I'll do a quick plug for a couple of things once you've finished, and then. Well,
look, but just to say that, I mean, I know both of you from past, but it's always fascinating to learn from you both. And these books, you know, we're hugely proud of both DK and RHS. But you know, it's brilliant when people like you who are so passionate, so knowledgeable, can share your knowledge so lightly with us and so easily. I don't know about the audience, but I am hugely enthused. All these little tips you've given us, and this feeling that actually every little action does help, and that you know, we're all going in the right direction, and then we just keep on doing that. So Sally and Kate, thank you so much for your time tonight, and best of luck with promoting the book.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
I have just put a link to our YouTube channel. I'm going to post this video, so if there's any information you want to come back on, I'm going to post this tomorrow, so you can reference it. If you just click the YouTube channel link there, and it will allow you to subscribe to it, so you'll get an alert when I post. Chris, thank you. You've been a legend. Kate and Sally, you're brilliant. There is the thought of doing this as a sort of monthly thing. I'm sure we'll have a little catch up with Chris and the DK team and the guys from the RHS. I'm up for it, assuming the audience are, and we've got lots of lovely authors willing to come along and join us. So I will give a couple of plugs. We've got a bit of fiction coming up for the next few days, and then we've got Jonathan Dimbleby on the 21st, which I think is Wednesday, and then on the 22nd I've got Richard Walker, the CEO of Iceland, talking with Chris Packham, and those are the only non-fiction things I can. Oak Papers, yeah, James Canton doing the Oak Papers in early June. So. You can get that from the Tring Book Festival website. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And yeah, we'll see you for our next one. I'll keep you all posted.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody. Good evening.
Good evening.